Hello and welcome back to Impact Factor. I'm your host, Katie Van Aken, and the very first thing I want to do is apologize for not posting an episode last week. After 2.5 years, I was finally taken down by the COVID, and you know what they say about being a couple weeks ahead of your your deadlines. That wasn't the case. So here we are. But moral of the story is it's okay to take a week off. It's okay to take a break. And I hope you guys didn't miss it too much. But hopefully we can make up for it in the next couple episodes. So today, I'd like to talk about publishing a manuscript. Because I think as a requirement, at least across most programs that I'm familiar with, there's a few things, but one thing that you sort of have to do before you can leave and graduate is publish a paper. And often it's published first author paper, which I'll get into in a second. But so there's a couple things that I think are important to keep in mind. First, what does it mean to write a paper? Honestly, I think in grad school, one of the things that you think you're going to be doing a lot is, research and lab work, and don't get me wrong, that's the case. But I think one thing that I benefited from grad school with was the ability to just churn out writing. And it is an acquired skill, and it's something that you can get better at. And therefore, one overall suggestion is to take advantage of any opportunity to write scientifically, whether in your program or before your program starts or outside of your program. Also offer to review other people's drafts and manuscripts, because that's the best way to learn. Okay, so let's jump in. So you're writing your first paper, now what? Well, first of all, at this point, you've hopefully and ideally read many scientific articles. So you sort of have a general idea of the structure. But there's a couple different sections of a scientific article, which include the title, obviously, the author list, which can be, anywhere from 1 to, 15 to 20 authors if it's a highly collaborative project. Then you have an abstract, which is a summary of the main point of the article. It's very short, often for publication sites that have a paywall. This is what you get to read without paying. So it's very little information, but it gives you the gist of the article, and therefore encourages you or discourages you from paying to see the rest of the article. After the abstract, we have the introduction. The introduction is sort of the summary of relevant information from the field, previously published works, and basically the platform for which this experiment or this investigation was performed. So everything that the reader needs to know to find meaning in your results. Then we have the materials and methods section. This is more of a quantitative section, I would say. Some steps, some procedures, some formulas, a lot around how the experiments were done, so that if someone was reading the paper and wanted to repeat them, they could. And this section is important for that. And then after that, you get to the results section, and this is really where the meat of the work is, because this is the data that you've collected. This is the experiments that you've run, and more importantly, it's how you present them. And you you can tell a story with data in any number of ways, but to really make it meaningful, you want it to be in a graph or a chart or something that's obtainable by the reader without them having to struggle over understanding what kind of a plot it is. I'll talk more about this in a second, but so after the results, you have discussion, and discussion can sometimes be a longer section if you present your results and then there's a lot to sort of discuss about them. Sometimes the results and discussion are intertwined in the sense that you present a section of results and discuss them, and then more results and discuss them. It sort of depends on the frame of the article and what you feel like the order and the importance should be. And then as part of the discussion, you'll end up with a sort of conclusion, maybe like a future steps sentence or two, or basically the lesson learned from the experiment. And then an optional section would be the acknowledgements, where you acknowledge anyone that helped, including funding sources, other collaborative institutions, and specific people if they were really an important help. And then finally, at the very end, you have your list of references, and those would be all of the articles that you referenced in your article to kind of build it out. And a lot of times when you're in the introduction, if you're referencing previous work, you will put a citation, and so someone can go and read that article if they want to know more about the data that you specifically mentioned. So that's it, right? It sounds like kind of a lot, but there's a couple things that I think can make the process easier, and I'm hoping to talk about them right now. So let's first start with where do I start? A lot of times I think when people go sit down to write something, they default to wanting to write it chronologically. And one thing that I learned early on was that I was much more successful writing these articles not chronologically, and sort of almost in the order in which I did the experiment. So the first thing I would recommend doing is come up with a title. In my head, anything that you are creating isn't really real until it has a title. And also, if it has a title, you can name the file and make a folder, and it just becomes more concrete. So it doesn't have to be the final title, but something interesting, something that covers the general idea that you're going to focus on. So once you have a title, there you go. You can check one section off your list. Then the next section that I find easiest to do is the materials and methods section. And part of the reason for that is that you know very clearly already what materials you used and what methods you used, because those are completed, the experiments are done, and you wouldn't be at the stage of writing a paper if all of that wasn't written somewhere in your lab notebook or in your notes somewhere. So I find it easy to sort of, I find it easier to ease into the process of writing a whole research paper by first starting with a section that talks about what I used and what I did with it and how I did it. And again, it doesn't have to be tip-top writing. You don't have to, this isn't like final draft status. We're just getting words on the page. And so your materials and methods section is an easy way to start getting words on the page. After that, there's a couple different ways you can go. Personally, I like to go to the results because I'm already sort of talking about the experimental process and how I did it. And so it leads very well into the outcomes. And the results section is, like I said, an important section because oftentimes people will jump right to that section when they're reading a research paper because they want to know if the results are relevant to their work or impactful in some way. And so it's important to think through how you want to present the results. And like I said before, the more understandable your result plot or chart is, the more meaningful it'll be for people, the more people will understand it, the more people will cite it, the more people will read your paper, et cetera, et cetera. So it's one thing to have meaningful results. It's another thing to have meaningful, understandable results and present them in that way. And so my advisor always used to say, we're telling a story, right? And the whole paper is telling a story, but you also want your results section to tell a story. You want it to be very clear when I look at the x-axis and the y-axis and the legend, what I'm looking at. And you can use color coding, you can use highlighting, figure captions are really important too, because the first place someone's going to look when they're trying to understand a figure is the words underneath it. And so don't throw those away as just, I have to write this sentence. Make sure that they have some meaning and provide the explanation that the graph doesn't, if needed. Excuse me. COVID remnants. So then, outside of the results, so at this time you've created your results story and chart, and so the real important part now is the discussion. And a lot of times I think it's good to get your results, get your plots, complete and visual, and then find someone who can talk through them with you, whether it's your advisor or a colleague, but someone who may have seen the results before or haven't, but you're showing them these plots for your paper now, and you're saying here's the point I'm trying to make, and here's what I'm going to include in my discussion, and see if that makes sense, see if they follow your train of thought, and then go back and write it all down. And like I said, if you have tons of results, you might want to sprinkle in discussion throughout. If you have one big result, you might want to be like, here's the data, now let's talk about it. And you want to reference back to the data as much as possible. You want to make it clear what the different lines, what the different parts mean. But remember that you've been looking at this for a long time, so you know exactly what you're looking at. So getting someone else to look at it and try and explain to them will help you make your discussion as clear as possible. Okay, so now we've sort of hopped into the middle of this paper, and we've written towards the end in a little bit of a chronological order. But at this point, the biggest section that is still missing is the introduction. And the reason I usually save the introduction for the end is the introduction is supposed to set up the problem or set up the reason for the experiment, or give you all the relevant information you need to understand the results of the experiment. Well, until you fully write the materials, results, and discussion sections, you don't really know what should be in the introduction. But now that we've done that, we know what to cover in the introduction. What previous work do we need to cite that matters? Did we cut out a section of the paper and therefore we don't need to cover that in the introduction anymore? It's much better to write the platform, the introduction that you need, now that you know what it needs to support. And So then you do that. And the introduction, can be different lengths. You don't want it to go too deep because you want the paper to be mostly about your work and your results. But you also need to give enough context. But to be fair, like when I'm reading a scientific article, I will read the introduction last. If I need it to give me context for the results, I'll go back and read it. But if I don't need it, I won't even look at it because it's not about that specific study. But that's why it's there, to support. And then finally, once you have your whole paper written, introduction through discussion, you can now put together an abstract. And I always found the abstract to be the hardest part of the article. And I think it's because you have to kind of boil everything down into a meaningful, impactful paragraph without providing actual numbers because there's no context around them, and without being too hand wavy, so that it without being too vague, so that people don't just ignore it. Anyway, I don't have a ton of suggestions for the abstract except to, you reference the problem, you reference maybe your method of solution, and then you message some general impact statement, or X% increase in blah blah blah, that will make people want to be like, oh, how did they get that? But again, I think people read the abstract and if they're generally interested in the context, in the content, they'll jump right ahead to the results and discussion. And then, it's really important, mostly if there's a paywall decision, but yeah. Okay, so we covered that. That's basically the meat of the paper. But there's one extra section I want to talk about, and that's the author list. One of the interesting things about an author list is it can be the reason for some disagreements amongst colleagues and collaborators, and I've witnessed many of them. I've been part of them, and it's never a great thing. But I think the author list and the acknowledgements list they go hand in hand, because you could be writing a paper that was all based on the work that you did by yourself, and so the only names that go on the paper are you and your advisor. And you go first because you did the work, you wrote the paper, and your advisor goes second or last. Typically, even in a multi-person article, if you had help, then your advisor would still go last because they're the distinguished name in the field. They provided the funding for you, and they, they sort of hold the weight of that author list together. And you would go first. Now, let's say that you really worked hand in hand with somebody else on this project. Pretty collaborative in the same group. Often you can decide who will be first author based on who takes the lead in putting together the paper and writing it. As we've said, this is not an easy job, and it shouldn't be overlooked as a big part of the process. And so, someone who's willing to write the article and make the figures and really do all of that work, that's one way to discern who's going to be the first author. In the case where both, there's two people that have really done an equal amount of work, there are occasionally situations with co-first authors, and that becomes clear. I think they put like an asterisk next to the two names. It's not as common, but it's completely acceptable. And there's bound to be situations where there are multiple people who have done an equally large amount of work to make this project and paper a success. And then the other thing too is, I was part of a lot of collaborative papers when I was in grad school, and so we had, sometimes close to 10 or 15 people on a paper. And it was really true that all of those people were part of it. But, there's something to be said too, that the way that I was always taught was that if you're wondering whether you should put somebody's name on a paper, ask the question of, could you have done this without their help? So if they have been trained in a really specific type of X-ray diffraction, and they are the only one who can possibly do it, and they did it for you, then they should be on the paper. Or if they were the one to do that, but they spent, hours and hours just collecting XRD data for your manuscript, and it was a highly important part of your conclusion, then they should be included, of course. You can get to a point where, yes, someone offered to help you out, but maybe they weren't really, integral in the conclusion of the paper. And in that case, another place you can put them is the acknowledgement section. And, one thing I learned getting my PhD was that it's actually kind of an honor to be included in the acknowledgement section, because, not only is this person, well, for one, if you're in a bunch of your lab mates' acknowledgement sections, that means that you're a team player. And I think if it's not taken as a sign these days, it should be that any student that shows up in everybody's acknowledgement section is clearly a very valuable member of the lab and also quite successful at what they do, or they wouldn't be able to help so many people with their research. I can see, though, however, if you have a sort of a requirement for a certain number of papers, and you just keep getting put in the acknowledgement section, that can get old. But I think that there's a balance to be had, and like I said, the question that I always asked myself was, could I have done this project? Could I have published this paper without this person's technique or skill set, or or were we just getting coffee and they happened to, ask me about my project and we had a nice chat, and that's sort of up to your discretion, and your advisor can also help you decide. But the other thing that goes along with choosing your author list is you also need, you should, as a courtesy, allow everyone on your author list to approve the manuscript at every stage. And that's again a professional courtesy, because you're putting their name on something, and they should not be unaware that their name is being put on something. And two, as on the other hand, if someone were to put your name on something, you would want to know and you'd want to read it, because you would want to know if you agree with everything that's being said. And like I said, usually the first one or two authors are in charge of writing and putting together the manuscript, but everybody else on the list is still an author. And so even if they just did the XRD section, they deserve to read the draft. They deserve to especially read the XRD section, and they also deserve to make comments about the conclusions if they disagree with anything that you're claiming. So anyway, that was kind of rambly, but I think the author list is important. and there's some nuance to it. And, but as a general rule, I think the person in charge of writing the article and getting it submitted and published is the first author, and then their advisor, who's providing the funding, is the last author. And there could be any number of people in between, typically ordered by impact, maybe effort, time spent. And I mean, in my experience, it generally was pretty clear what the order should be. And there were always a few questions about who should be included or not. And then you just, that level at which you decide to cut it, you put those people in the acknowledgments and you thank them for their help with XYZ, to get the paper published. Yeah, so that's that. Author list, references. Oh yeah, so the other thing I was going to talk about was your first draft. So I don't know how it is for everybody, but in my experience, your PI will want to see a first draft of your article before, at some point, right? And so what should that look like? Well, everything I said about writing your first paper, again, you're just trying to get words on a page. My advice is, once you get all the words on the page, that does not constitute your first draft yet. There's at least one, if not two more iterations of editing to get it to the point where you should send it to your advisor. One thing's for sure, your figures should be basically as finalized as you think they should be when you send that to your professor. And the reason behind that is, in my experience, most PIs look very, very specifically at the figures, because they know that those are the ones that are going to be referenced, are going to be, snipped and shown in presentations, and they want to make sure that they are accurate and also look good. So don't rely on some older version of the figures. Make sure your figures are basically finalized. And you're going to need high definition version of the figures to upload to the submission site eventually. So make sure you have those as well. As far as the rest of the draft, I would, maybe at this point you and your PI have discussed an actual title, so you have the title pretty solidified, you have the author list. And then I would make sure that, like I said, the words and everything, the story, the references, everything has been written and also reviewed and edited. And in the best case scenario, you've given it to someone you trust, a colleague, maybe the second author, to read through it as well and check for grammar and all of that stuff. Because the last thing you want to do is hand something to your PI and they're so distracted by grammar and spelling and other things that they don't get the full impact of the paper and can't give you feedback about the story because they're so hung up on all the little stuff. And, that includes references at the end. My advisor used to really dig into the reference list, and if any of them were formatted incorrectly, or if the citation manager I was using, messed anything up, he would flag it right away. And so that was distracting. So I learned to check that first before I sent the draft to him. And yeah, like I said, I think it's important to get someone else to read it, both for grammar and spelling, but also for just like general thoughts. And it's a good idea to get someone else who isn't as close to it to get their opinion on it as well. And then so that's your first draft. And then, at that point, your advisor gives you the okay, and you can submit to a journal, and then you wait and see. And that can sometimes be hard, and sometimes it takes a long time, and we'll talk about getting reviews back in another episode. But celebrate the victory, the small victory. Well, it's a large victory of submitting a paper, because it's a lot of work, and it's one of the milestones of getting your PhD that everybody's been through and will be through. And honestly, it's more fun to do it with your colleagues, to do a collaborative piece, but you also, can really feel good about publishing a solo paper with just you and your advisor. So, however it lays out, there's pros and cons in both ways. On a related note, I wanted to highlight something I said about including the author. So one thing that can be kind of a hack is if you seek to be included on many papers, one thing you can do early on in your career is become an expert in some kind of unique technique or experimentation process, or basically be the person that is needed to run a specific type of experiment on somebody's samples, or be able to run a high temperature chamber for somebody's experiments. So then when there are some studies that will need to use that type of technique, you will sort of get called upon to collaborate. And ideally, if it doesn't require a ton of extra work from you, you'll end up getting included on some pretty cool papers as somebody that really provided a lot of the experimental support for the project. But again, if being on papers isn't really your first goal, let's say you want to go into industry and it doesn't really matter how much you publish, then you can take that, with a grain of salt. But it is kind of a way to increase your number of papers early on. I think that's it that I have for today. We will, like I said, we'll talk about reviewing and getting paper reviews back at another time. Let us know if you have questions, and if anyone is interested in being interviewed on the pod, shoot me a message or reach out on LinkedIn. Thanks again, and have a great week.